So the McKinney-Vento Act is a federal act that gives youth experiencing homelessness rights to a variety of things, all of which are pertaining to education. So its purpose is to ensure that every student has an equitable opportunity to an equitable education, right? An education that serves them, that helps them do all the things we know education does, and move up the ladder is a big one, especially for our students experiencing homelessness. The McKinney-Vento Act, some of the rights that it gives students is their right to their school of origin. So for example, if a student is attending school in Uptown and they become homeless, that student has the right to continue at that school in Uptown. And there are a lot of studies that show that students see better success when they're able to stay at the same school, right? It's like any of us starting a new job, right? You gotta kind of feel out the lay of the land. You gotta figure out what the culture is, what are the expectations, what is my new role? Every time a student changes schools, that has to happen again, right? We know our education is not standard across the board. We see it in our CPS schools. Our schools vary between Lincoln Park and Garfield Park and Uptown for many reasons. So we could definitely get into a rabbit hole later of why. But this really helps to ensure that the student is able to keep that consistency and continue building those relationships with adults at that school as well as their peers. If a student decides to change schools because of their homeless situation, so let's say your student is now living in Inglewood, which we know is really hard to get to from Uptown and vice versa. It's quite a long train ride. If the student decides and their family decides, hey, I actually would rather go to the school here in Inglewood, it is their right to immediate enrollment. So if anyone ever tells the parent like, hey, we need your child's birth certificate, or we need you to prove that you're experiencing homelessness and living here, that is against the law. The Coalition for the Homeless is the support system that we have here in Chicago. It's where we direct parents when they explain to us that they're having that experience. And so really happy to have this connection with Alyssa, hoping that she's able to log back out. She emailed me and let me know she's logging back in. But that's kind of our next step is like, okay, your rights were violated. Let's get you in contact with a lawyer from the Coalition for the Homeless. The student also has the right to attend any school that they've attended between the time they became homeless and the time at the end of the school year that they are no longer experiencing homelessness. So let's say the student, becomes homeless, has to move to Inglewood, and then they go to school there. They move shelters, which we see a lot with our students, and now they're in Austin, right? And they want to stay at their school at Inglewood. That is also considered their school of origin, and so they have the right to keep going there until they're housed at the end of the school year. So let's say they get housed in March, they would still go there or have the right to go there until the school year ends. Hey, Alyssa, glad to hear that you're back. I was just explaining a little bit the intricacies of School of Origin and McKinney-Vento and how that looks in practice within STLS. But of course, we're excited to hear a little bit more in depth. And then I spoke a little bit to how the Coalition for the Homeless provides that support when families' rights are violated.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Being patient at the Wi-Fi is always a tricky thing. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Awesome. So you guys can all hear me now? Wonderful. Yes. Okay, so I'll just, since you guys kind of gave the intro, I'll quickly go through this. But the Lab Project was founded in the 90s, and we have this Youth Futures mobile legal clinic. To kind of start with the numbers of students experiencing homelessness. So in the 2018-2019 school year, it was a little over 53,000. And for comparison, Wrigley Field, where the Cubs play, can host a little over 41,000. So we have quite a large number of students who are experiencing homelessness. And with the eviction moratorium and job loss with COVID, we're expecting that there's going to be a higher number of students who are experiencing homelessness, but also a higher number of students who don't get identified because students often get identified in the school system, right? So it's a lot harder when there is this distance learning. So really briefly, I just kind of want to go over what are the main laws when we are doing advocacy for a student who's experiencing homelessness. So, right, we have the big overarching McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, and that's the federal legislation. But then the Illinois also has the Illinois Education for Homeless Children Act, the Illinois Equal Opportunity Regulation, and then there's policy of the Illinois State Board of Education on the education of homeless children and youth. Then Chicago Public Schools specifically has policies to address students experiencing homelessness. And then recently, the Illinois State Board of Education also posted in policies ways to support students experiencing homelessness. So whenever we're doing advocacy, you always kind of want to look at the robust legislation because I think there's actually a lot of really good, this is one area where there's a lot of really excellent law, and it has to do with implementation. That's kind of where the breakdown happens. This might have been mentioned, but just kind of as an overview, we always like to bring it back to what the main purpose of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act is. So the main purpose is to ensure that each child of a homeless individual and each homeless youth has equal access to the same free, appropriate public education. And we say that all those words are really important, right? So it's not just about making sure homeless students are in school, but making sure that they're having access to that appropriate education. So if that is, a gifted program, then that is, what is going to be appropriate. If that's an ESL program, if that's having an IEP or a 504 plan, making sure that students are in the place that best fits their needs. And then to eliminate barriers to the identification of or the enrollment, attendance, or success in school of homeless children and youth. So if something isn't explicit in the law, so I think COVID is a great example, right? There's nothing in the law kind of about what do you do with distance learning for students experiencing homelessness. But McKinney-Vento is very clear that schools are called to eliminate barriers. So we took that model to advocate for things like CPS providing laptops to every student enrolled in the Students in Temporary Living Situations program because technology is a huge barrier. So we always kind of bring it back to these two things, the appropriate public education, and if this is causing a barrier, then we need to eliminate it. So I think something that's really important about McKinney-Vento, and I think especially during this time is important, is the definition. So McKinney-Vento, out of all federal programs, probably has the broadest definition of who counts as experiencing homelessness. And the way that it does this is it gives specific fact examples that count, but then also kind of an overarching guide to what counts. So as you see, right, so there's a list like living in emergency or transitional shelter, sharing housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason, living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, camping grounds due to the lack of alternative adequate accommodations. And the sharing housing we bold because that's disproportionately how students experience homelessness in Illinois. So I think it's about like 83% around there of students in CPS who are experiencing homelessness, they're living doubled up. So they're not necessarily in a shelter, they're sharing housing. And I think we sometimes have this perception that living doubled up is easier or maybe less vulnerable. But I think especially now during COVID, right, if you don't have a safe place to quarantine, you have so many people living in one roof that it's hard to clean or, to stay safe. It can be very hard, especially when you don't have, you're not on a lease, you don't have a legal right to be there. You could be kicked out at any moment. And right now with shelters, decompressing, not as open, can be a very scary situation to be in. And then living in cars. Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just had a question.
Yeah.
What else would be defined, I'm sorry, on the last slide, in the bolded, it says, or similar reason. Could you give some examples of where, like, in law, you would say, like, this is the case and this falls under similar reason?
Yeah, so one that's really common is, let's say there's a big like water damage or fire, or there's something like maybe someone has a home or an apartment, but it's uninhabitable and they don't have enough money, to do the necessary repairs to make it livable. So their option is that they have to, move in with someone else. So we get a lot of that. Or when there's natural disasters. I think another common one is like we had a case where a family had had a very tragic murder happen of the two family members, and it was there had been threats towards the mom and the daughter who lived there, and so they weren't safe staying there. They didn't feel safe staying there, and so they didn't have money to find a new place, so they had to live doubled up. But because of kind of the circumstances of this tragic murder, they couldn't safely stay there. So I think it's basically any situation where you are living doubled up not because you want to, right? So if you're just roommates, if you have two people like who decide to live together so they can split costs, that's not going to be living doubled up. But anytime you kind of have someone who's staying with someone else because they just don't have another option, they don't have enough for a security deposit, they don't have enough money, there's some reason they can't stay at their other place, that's going to count. So it's pretty broad. And that's going to bring me up to kind of the second way this definition works is on the top of this where it says those who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So the definition gives all these specific examples, but then it gives us overarching. So fixed, regular, and adequate. So if a housing situation doesn't meet any of these specific examples, or it's unclear if it meets one of these examples, then you go to that. So is this living situation fixed, regular, and adequate? So you could have someone who has a lease, they're the mortgage holder, but there's 10 people in a 2-bedroom home, and maybe there's not consistent access to running water, maybe there's exposed wires, asbestos, that's also going to count. So it's very fact specific. You really got to look into kind of what is happening. Is this fixed, regular, and adequate? So then here's some other examples: living in cars, parks, public spaces, substandard housing. A primary nighttime residence not designed for or ordinarily used as regular sleeping accommodations. So this one we've seen a lot where maybe we had a client recently who the mom worked at a salon, and so they were sleeping in the salon. So yes, it's like a building, but that's not what we typically think of as a regular place for someone to sleep. So that would also count. And then migratory children living in any of the above described situations. And then that brings us to kind of unaccompanied homeless youth. So these are youth who are not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. And they could also be considered homeless if they're meeting any of the above definitions. So a classic example we see a lot is, let's say you have a youth who maybe ran away from home or was kicked out of their home and they're staying with a grandma. But grandma doesn't have legal custody, grandma doesn't have guardianship. That child is going to be an unaccompanied homeless youth because they're not in the physical custody of a parent and they would be considered living doubled up. And there's no age limit for an unaccompanied youth. So technically you could have a preschool student in the same situation. And what we kind of look at for that is the why doesn't matter so much as the kind of physical location of the child. So it doesn't matter if the child like ran away, if the parents are willing to let them back. It doesn't matter if the child is technically, maybe they're a youth in care, maybe they are in a foster care placement. As long as the child is not in the physical custody of the person who has guardianship or custody, they are in this category. And so that can be an important distinction. One thing else just to kind of note is they did remove awaiting foster care placement from this definition. So children who are in foster care placement, it can get a little tricky, but they're basically have the same rights. It's just housed in a different piece of legislation. So is there any other questions about definitions? I'm going to pause right here and kind of go into some rights. So if there is any that you want to put in the, people want to put in the chat.
So I have one question.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit about how the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness differs from other definitions of homelessness across federal agencies?
Yes. So the biggest one is the sharing of housing. So for example, HUD, sorry, Housing and Urban Development, and how those that agency, which is going to determine, public housing, housing vouchers, they do not include sharing housing of others. So they kind of most of the other federal programs definitions have to do with either chronic homelessness or literal homelessness. So being in a shelter, being in a living on the street, or like residing in a car, basically. So all the other examples that have to do with substandard housing or sharing housing are not included. And as I mentioned earlier too, right? So disproportionately, this is families experience homelessness living doubled up. Because there's a lot of rules around shelters, they have limits of how many people they can take. People don't always feel safe. So it can be really hard for those programs because the vast majority of families aren't going to qualify to access them because they're living doubled up. Okay, so I'm going to talk about kind of some of the main rights. So the first one, and probably the biggest, is immediate enrollment. So homeless students have a right to be immediately enrolled in school, no matter what. So even if they missed an application deadline, even if they don't have all their records, even if they don't have transcripts, birth certificates, the school has to enroll them. And immediate means like literally immediate. Like it means right then and there. It does not mean, in a week when the school has kind of figured out what's happening. They need to immediately enroll that student, and then they need to figure out how they're going to assist the family in getting, those documents. And this is for any family who comes in and says or is expected to be experiencing housing insecurity. And I think a big one is immunization records and birth certificates are kind of the ones schools tend to not want to enroll students on, because outside of McKinney-Vento, they require those things. But the law is very, very clear. There's no documentation a school can require for a homeless family to enroll. And immediate enrollment also means like attending classes, participating fully in school. So it's not like you can enroll the child but then not have them, actually come to school or participate till they have those documents. They need to enroll them. Where this one comes up a lot is with transcripts. So if you have a youth who maybe is in high school and they don't want to enroll them in classes till they have their transcripts, what the school needs to be doing is enrolling them, putting them in the classes they think they're eligible for, and then if the transcript says differently, they can adjust. But they need to enroll them.
We also have a question.
Alyssa, Oh yeah, go ahead. So we have one question from Beverly Jones. So she says, does this also able to students who are currently living in an extended family situation, and what is the age limit? I work with teens that are currently living in extended family homes, and does extended family qualify as being homeless?
Yes. So again, that's a really good question. So it can be a little bit tricky because these are all very fact specific. But basically the things you look at is the child or the family, do they have a legal right to be where they are? Right? So you could be in an extended living situation, and if the child's parent or guardian is on the lease, that's not going to be a homeless situation, even if other folks are staying in the home for that student. So if that student's particular either custodial caregiver or their guardian is on the lease and it's not a substandard housing situation, they wouldn't be experiencing homelessness. But if the child is living with, a grandma or an aunt, or someone who does not have actual legal custody of them or guardianship, that would be considered experiencing homelessness. Or let's say that, mom and child move in with grandparents, that's considered experiencing homelessness. So if you live with friends or relatives, even if it's your whole family unit, that student is still going to be considered experiencing homelessness. So what you kind of look at is who's on the lease, where is the child sleeping, and there's a whole thing about I think I get to it later, but every school has to have what they call an STLS liaison in Chicago. And this person is supposed to kind of navigate and ask sensitive questions to figure out the living situation. So an extended family situation can absolutely be a homeless situation. So you just kind of have to look at the specifics of that fact scenario.
Alyssa, Beverly added, I am asking because I have been trying to help one of my families enroll her teen daughter back into school. She also has a child. So the family isn't on the lease. They are staying with other families, and it's several family members who are staying.
Yeah, so that would definitely be a homeless situation. So the student should qualify to be in the STLS program. And my email is on this slide presentation, so definitely feel free to reach out if there are issues with the school actually enrolling the student, but they should qualify.
Yeah, Alyssa, that was one of the other questions I have, and it might make more sense to get to it later. But if we could just talk a little bit about what to do when your rights have been violated. And like we hear a lot, the Coalition for the Homeless. I think for me, as someone who tries to make that connection, I never know like who exactly to go to. So that would be really helpful to cover as well.
Yeah, so I can definitely say that. So I am our education attorney. So you can 100%, and I can include it in the chat box. I can give you my email and phone number. I'm kind of our go-to education person. So I'm definitely the person you can reach out to. So I think what ends up happening, so Chicago Public Schools has they call it their STLS department, so students in temporary living situations. And the CPS program is, managed by people who really have a very in-depth understanding of McKinney-Vento for the most part. What ends up happening is every school has an STLS liaison, but this often is we call it like a comma job. So it's often someone who is the school guidance counselor, and then they get told by their principal, comma, we're going to also have you be the STLS liaison. So it's often people who already have a ton on their plate and are often kind of voluntold to do this job. And so, what that causes is they do have to go through training, but a lot of the times they are not experts in McKinney-Vento and what counts. And so sometimes what ends up happening is if you go straight to the school, maybe some of the liaisons are fantastic and they're going to, point you in the right direction. They're going to get you enrolled, but some might not know. They might just not know all the intricacies. So I think at that point, what we do a lot is we help families make a fast connection to the STLS department. So we have a pretty good kind of just clear system, and I think it helps STLS move faster when, we kind of advocate on behalf of the parent. or student. And so, yeah, you can definitely reach out to me, and we can do that. You can reach out to the STLS department, has a hotline number, which is on their website, that you can definitely, call to get information. But I think, obviously at any time you can kind of already have that pre-existing condition, relationship, that's the easiest kind of way to do it. And then outside of that, right, so most of the time we're pretty successful because the law is pretty clear. We're pretty successful in, getting the school to comply. But then if the school doesn't comply, the family can bring what's called a McKinney-Vento dispute. And basically the school and or a parent can bring this dispute up, but it's whenever there's an issue. So whenever there's a problem that, a family feels their rights have been violated, and then CPS has a procedure. So you would bring that up to the STLS department. And that's also something you can get an attorney for, and something that we represent families for at the coalition.
Melissa, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So I definitely see like your organization where, you mentioned that you connect the families to the STLS liaison. Are the STLS liaisons required to reach out to the families just in the beginning, like, hey, I'm here to help you out, you can contact me?
Yeah, so they are required to post notices in the school, like posters that talk about the STLS department. And it differs on schools. Some schools do a great job, it's in their orientation packets, it's on their website, it's very, they make the information very clear. Other schools don't. And so I think that's kind of what's hard, is there is a really big, it depends, schools that have a high number of STLS students tend to, have the information out there and parents are aware. Sometimes schools that don't have high populations, they don't, because maybe they don't think that, they have as many students who are experiencing homelessness. So they're required to give notice. I think with distance learning, that will probably look different. So they are required to give notice. Some schools do a much better job than others. Okay, so I guess this also kind of relates to that. So schools and districts are required to remove barriers to identification, enrollment, and retention of homeless students. So that goes to kind of posting notice, removing barriers to fees and absences. And I think this is a big deal with during COVID, is a lot of schools are doing online enrollment. And so schools are supposed to make sure that even if the enrollment or registration is online, that there's a way for homeless families to get connected to the McKinney-Vento liaison, to the STLS liaison, and to be enrolled in that program. So there should be a process online for that to happen, and there should be notice to families, so that even if it's online, that's not like creating a barrier for those families.
Alyssa, do you know, is there like a public STLS liaison directory?
So I have one. I can definitely send it around. One thing that's kind of hard is a position in individual schools that tends to change a lot. But I can definitely send around to the, I always think the best thing to do is the STLS managers, Chevelle Bailey, Claire Bowman, are really awesome. We work with them a lot, and they're really great advocates. They're in the overall STLS program. So I can send around after this their information, because I think it's really great to reach out to them, and they can reach out to the individual school liaisons, and that tends to be a much smoother process. But yes, there is a list. I don't know if it's public, but I can definitely send it around, just knowing that it does change. So, it might be a different number or a different person by the time someone is reading it. So one thing that's really important too with enrollment is that unaccompanied youth don't need an adult to enroll. And again, there's no age to this. So if you have a homeless youth not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian, they can enroll in school. That's the end of the story. They can enroll in school. So I think sometimes schools don't, this kind of scares them. They don't want to enroll a 15-year-old, but they legally can and have to. So they need to have some type of policy in place to enroll unaccompanied homeless youth. And a lot of the times we see schools will tell someone like, oh, you can't, like a caretaker. So let's say the youth is couch surfing and the adult at an adult's house and the adult takes them to enroll. The school will sometimes tell the student like, oh, you should go get guardianship if you want to enroll the student, but that's actually absolutely not the case. They can sometimes be really harmful. So even without that, they can 100% be enrolled, and the school needs to have a way to do that. So I know you kind of talked about choice of schools, so I'll go through this really briefly. Basically, we break it down into 3. There are 3 types of schools homeless students have a choice to enroll. So they can be enrolled in their local school. So if wherever they're experiencing homelessness, living doubled up or in a shelter, wherever other students in that area are allowed to attend. Then they can attend what's called their school of origin, which we break down into 2 schools. So the school the youth or child was last enrolled. And this also includes receiving schools. So this isn't as much a thing in CPS, but if you have an 8th grade, that pretty much all those students are going to go into that same high school. That high school is going to be their school of origin too. Or the school attended when the child was last permanently housed. So the big difference with this is that there can be a gap in the second one. So let's say you were permanently housed and attending school A, you became homeless and attended school B for a little while. While you're still homeless, you have a right to go back to school A. And this is a really big deal because we know students lose a lot of education every time that they, transfer schools. And staying in the school of origin is really important. And I think this is also really important during distance learning, that you have, if everything else is kind of changing, that you have some consistency. So this is the attendance area school where and they also have a right to attend. And then, so in CPS, right, you have like these choice programs and you have option schools, and states have to have procedures that ensure homeless students, are able to attend these. And so if that means removing certain barriers, this comes up a lot with like selective enrollment schools or magnet schools. And then, so for youth too, there needs to be procedures to count for partial credit. So we know, homeless students are often very transient, and it can be a nightmare with credits, right? I've had a lot of clients where, they're a junior in high school, but they've attended 6 high schools already. So the school needs to work with them to figure out the credit situation. And liaisons too are supposed to help unaccompanied homeless youth fill out their financial aid information. So if you're an unaccompanied homeless youth, you can fill out financial aid as an independent student, meaning you don't need to have your parents' information. And this can be a big deal because it might not be safe for that student to get information from their parents. It might not be, a healthy decision. And so liaisons are supposed to make sure that homeless unaccompanied youth are able to figure that, assist them with that. Another big thing that's kind of newer to the law is around preschool. So now preschool counts as a school of origin, and there needs to be removal of barriers also for pre-K, which we know early learning is a big deal. And in CPS too, what this looks like is students experiencing homelessness are supposed to have priority for preschool enrollment. So transportation,
Sorry, I just had a quick question about the school of origin. So in the case scenario you gave where like student moves from school A to school B, let's say the student has to switch shelters and is now at school C. Is school A and B are also considered their school of origins, correct?
Yeah, so the school attended when the child was last permanently housed isn't going to change, no matter kind of wherever they change shelters. What could change is this first definition of the school of origin. So if the child, so let's say child was, housed and attending school A, became homeless, staying at a shelter, attending school B, moved to a different shelter, attending school C. School C is a school of origin and school A is a school of origin, but not school B. Because now the last school the child was enrolled in is school C. If that makes sense. So the last school attended, that's going to stay the same when permanently housed. That will always be the same. But the school or the child was last enrolled in is just literally whatever school they were last enrolled in.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So transportation. So this is one of the rights that I think we're seeing the biggest change with distance learning. So homeless students attending their school of origin are entitled to transportation services to and from school, as well as for school-related activities continuously through the end of the academic year. And we also say, so you'll notice transportation isn't in the law provided to children attending their attendance area school, which is one of the choices. But we always say that if lack of transportation is creating a barrier, the school still has to provide enrollment or transportation. So obviously we know distance learning students aren't being transported to school. So we've seen this kind of play out in a couple ways. So we were successfully able to get CPS to give bus cards to homeless families to like pick up computers and devices. Because, they had these cards. Because in CPS, they use the CTA cards. And we were able to, there was a couple families we had who needed to go to doctor's appointments, and CPS did agree to give them bus cards because they would have otherwise been giving them bus cards. So I think this looks a little different and might require a little bit of advocacy during distance learning of how that transportation looks. Like in suburban school districts, I think a lot of schools are reappropriating these funds. But I think in CPS, because they use bus cards, they're, letting families use them for essential things if you kind of ask and advocate for it. I don't think it's something schools are necessarily like advertising, but we were able to on some of that. And basically the transportation services need to be comparable to other students. I think another way that schools are using this now is to transport food to families. So we saw families who couldn't get to schools to pick up food when the schools were giving food out, then the school was delivering it, which was something that families could also request. So as I kind of mentioned, there's nothing in McKinney-Vento that specifies, transportation has to look like X. It just says it has to be appropriate. So, suburban areas tend to they could reimburse families, use, gas card, school bus. Public transportation is disproportionate, is mostly what gets used in CPS. You can also ask for hardship transportation if you can't, there's some barrier to using public transportation. So if there's, a physical reason you can't access public transportation, or there's a timing reason or a location, then you can request hardship transportation. And we request this a lot for shelter-based families because shelters can have really strict times, like if you have to be out of the shelter at this time and back at this time. So you can definitely request hardship transportation for that.
I have a question. So would this apply if the student wants to stay after school to participate in a school activity, or just school hours? Okay.
Yep. So school activities definitely count. Okay. So then school fees. So most Illinois schools, including CPS, do school fees. But for students in the STLS program, the Students in Temporary Living Situations program, school fees are waived. And the reason they're waived is that the Illinois School Code states that fees must be waived for all students whose parents are unable to afford them. And those include students eligible for free breakfast and lunch, and homeless students are categorically eligible for free breakfast and lunch. So their school fees get waived, and we get a lot of cases about this. I also just want to highlight, like, students can also get be eligible for school fee waivers if they're low income. So we get a lot of families who are at risk of homelessness. Maybe they're technically housed, but they're at risk of homelessness. If you financially qualify, you can still get school fee waivers. And we do a lot of those cases because schools will often, tell them, like, oh, if you're not literally experiencing homelessness, you're not in the STLS program, it doesn't count. You can't get the school fee waiver. And because it can end up being a lot of money. So the school code, the administrative code, states which things do get waived, which are listed right there. So school records, health fees, required textbooks, deposits collected by the school for use of school property, field trips made during school hours, deposits for uniforms, participation in extracurricular activities, graduation, that's a big one we get a lot of calls about, driver's education fees. And with COVID, it's been a little different. We haven't seen, I think it's still a little unclear what school fees are going to look like, if they're going to, be reduced, if they're going to be changed to now kind of be used for technology, and what that will look like. But then basically it comes down to a school fee is going to be anything that's required, or a key part of kind of the educational experiences. And the ISB regulations do also say what things aren't considered school fees. These are a little, and in light of COVID, these aren't as relative, but like things like prom, optional travel, admission to school dances, library fines, class rings, yearbooks, anything that's deemed extra. But one thing too, which is important, is there can't be discrimination or punishment of any kind if a family can't pay school fees. So the context we see this is if a school says, well, a student can't buy a prom ticket until they've paid their school fees. We consider that a punishment because that could be an important part of the, educational experience for a student. So we say, like, the school doesn't have to waive the prom fee, but they can't tell the student they can't pay for prom or attend prom because there is this outstanding fee.
Alyssa, I'm not sure if it was on the slide or not. Are sports included in those fees?
Yes. So let's see. They are included. Yeah. So charges or deposits for uniforms, gotcha, or equipment related to varsity and intramural sports. And two, I guess as you bring this up, one thing we've noticed a lot that I want to highlight is this includes like all those types of programs. So we had a student where they were on the cheerleading squad and they were required to wear these certain types of bows. And the school didn't want to waive the cost of the bows because they were saying it was like extra, even though, they 100% covered all the football fees for uniforms. So it doesn't matter what varsity sport this is, or if it's a fine arts, if it's required, if it's something the coach or the teacher says you need to have this, it's to participate, it's going to get waived.
Okay. And then I had another question, and we have a question for the chat.
Yeah.
I was wondering, do families ever try to seek hardship transportation for safety reasons?
Yes. So we actually have had a couple cases where the family, because of the school closures in 2013, had to cross a pretty like visibly known gang line, and had this really horrible experience when they were walking. The mom was walking with her little child and saw a pretty violent act that really scared the child. And so we were able to request hardship transportation for that. The CPS will always try to do bus cards first. So like, let's say in CPS, they're attending their neighborhood school and it's pretty close to the shelter. but you have to walk through something that the parent or the child doesn't feel comfortable walking. If there is a bus route, it's pretty easy to get CPS to agree to give out bus cards. And I think it takes a slightly heavier lift to actually ask for that door-to-door hardship transportation, but it 100% can be done. Yeah.
Okay. And Erica Walker, who is our program manager at Chicago Hopes, asks, part of our challenge is that our program works with most clearly identifiable students experiencing homelessness. How can our organization better educate the public / our partners about students' rights? The people who need to know this most are not consistently receiving this information.
Yeah, so I think that is a really good question and something that we've also been talking a lot about with distance learning. It's a lot harder to see, families who are living doubled up or, what have it be. One thing that we've really been, thinking of is kind of creatively, who are those community partners who maybe engage with families on different things that could incorporate trauma-informed questions about housing. So we've had a big meeting with like medical professionals and like pediatricians about like including a question about housing, and letting them know, like, posting a poster in the exam room about, if your child's experiencing homelessness, there are certain rights in school and like what's the number to contact, and kind of creating those lines. So I think that's one, is thinking like, even if it's not a service provider who provides housing or kind of a support that naturally fits, thinking through like, can there be questions? A big one too we've been talking about is like preschool providers. So one of the growing groups of people experiencing homelessness is preschool age students. Just because you have a lot of, young families, costs lots of money. And so thinking through like, how can preschool providers kind of incorporate those trauma-informed questions? So I think one thing is just thinking about how can this be incorporated in things that maybe traditionally wouldn't be. I think another thing we are also doing in these next couple weeks, like doing door hangers with information in certain neighborhoods. So maybe it is kind of gathering people or volunteers who want to, do something like that and having that out there, incorporating it in like social media posts, figuring out ways to kind of just, spread the information. It's been hard this year too, because one of the key ways we spread is back to school fairs, which, a lot of them, those have been canceled this year. So I think, we've been thinking about, how can we kind of get this information out there? So I think we've been dropping off a lot of our flyers and like backpack drives that schools are doing. And so, so I think it's just kind of thinking through, what are those ways? And can we always make sure that we kind of have a go-to set of questions that can maybe gauge this for the not as clearly visible families? And I think that's going to be an even bigger thing when the eviction moratorium does lift. We do really think there's going to be this large increase. And so how do we identify those families, especially when we don't exactly know how long distance learning is going to happen? So some of maybe those easily markable things aren't going to be there. It's a little hard to, gauge maybe attitude or attendance virtually. So I think that's a good question. So I'm just gonna really quickly, because I know it's just about time. I mentioned this before, but there is, if there's a disagreement with the school, if someone feels their rights have been violated, there's a very clear procedure, and definitely something you can reach out to me to get more information if there is a family who wants to go through that. And then kind of, no matter what, even during the resolution, they have to keep the child enrolled. All the same rights and protections still remain. And then just very briefly, I also wanted to say around identification documents has been really hard during COVID. And Vital Records is starting to open up, but if you're experiencing homelessness, you can get your birth certificate for free, which is a really important thing to get other documents. And then 2, for unaccompanied youth, I just wanted to mention super briefly that there are these Illinois laws, the minor consent to mental health care, minor consent to primary health care, that minors can fully access. And again, if you want more information, you could definitely reach out. So yeah, this is my contact information. This is my direct line and my email. So if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to talk through something or to provide assistance in any way that I can. So thank you guys so much for having me and for bearing with me through the technological difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We'll leave some time for folks who want to ask questions. Feel free to throw them in the chat. Really quickly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our Chicago Hopes for Kids calls to action. Yes, you'll have access to the PowerPoint, and I'll also send a recording of this to everyone who registered. So this year, our call to action for this event is to ask folks to donate to our snack drive. So every year we serve about 120 students living across 9 shelters. Whether we have in-person or virtual programming, our students will still need access to snacks. And when COVID originally happened, we cleared our shelves to be able to disseminate those resources across shelters. But now we're empty again. And so we're asking everyone to get involved if you can. You can do that on our website at chicagohopesforkids.org or through our Amazon wish list. Everyone who registered will get a thank you email with information, the PowerPoint slides. Alyssa also sent me some links to some really great resources that folks can access online. And then I'll also include the Amazon wish list in the Chicago Hopes for Kids website. Okay, I think that was all. If no one has any further questions, then once again, thank you so much, Alyssa, for presenting. This was really awesome, really informative. And of course, thank you to everyone else who attended. Tomorrow is our last workshop. It'll be a Q&A with our founder, Patricia Rivera. So if you're able to, please attend. If not, thank you so much for attending this event, whether it was just this one or throughout the week. I can't believe we're already nearing the end. It seems so strange. But has been really awesome to hear just like everything that everyone has had to say. So thank you.